June 5, 2004. Moscow, Mikhail Gorbachev's office at the Gorbachev Foundation on Leningradsky Prospect, late evening. The former Soviet president sat at his desk composing a tribute to Ronald Reagan, who had died earlier that day at his home in California after a decade-long struggle with Alzheimer's disease, a tribute that Western media outlets had requested, and that Gorbachev felt both obligated and genuinely moved to provide, despite the complicated feelings he harbored toward the American president who had been his partner and adversary during the final years of the Cold War. Gorbachev was 73 years old, no longer wielding political power in the Russia that had emerged from the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991, remembered in the West as the visionary leader who had ended the Cold War but viewed with far more ambivalence in Russia, where many blamed him for the Soviet Union's dissolution and for the economic chaos that had followed, and now confronting the death of the man whose relationship with Gorbachev had defined both their legacies. The relationship between Gorbachev and Reagan had been unlike any previous relationship between Soviet and American leaders during the Cold War, characterized by personal engagement that went beyond formal diplomatic protocols, and by genuine efforts to understand each other's perspectives despite profound ideological differences. They had met for the first time in Geneva in November 1985, less than a year after Gorbachev became General Secretary, at a summit where both leaders surprised their advisors by developing personal rapport that neither had anticipated and that created possibilities for reducing tensions that conventional diplomatic approaches had failed to achieve. Gorbachev had come to power in March 1985, inheriting a Soviet Union in deep crisis, with an economy stagnating under the burden of military spending that consumed perhaps a quarter of Soviet gross domestic product, with a political system calcified by decades of Brezhnev-era corruption, with technological gaps between Soviet and Western capabilities widening despite enormous investments, and with a war in Afghanistan draining Soviet resources while demonstrating the limits of Soviet military power. Gorbachev recognized more clearly than his predecessors that fundamental reforms were necessary, that the Soviet Union could not sustain indefinite military competition with the United States while also modernizing its economy, and that reducing Cold War tensions through arms control agreements was essential for creating space to implement domestic reforms. Reagan represented everything Gorbachev's ideological training had taught him to oppose. A conservative American president who had called the Soviet Union an evil empire, who had initiated the largest peacetime military buildup in American history, who had deployed intermediate-range nuclear missiles in Europe despite massive Soviet propaganda campaigns opposing the deployments, who had supported anti-communist forces worldwide with weapons and funding, and who had announced the Strategic Defense Initiative promising to develop space-based missile defenses that could negate Soviet nuclear deterrent and force the Soviet Union into expensive countermeasures that its economy could not afford. But Gorbachev also recognized that Reagan was the American leader he had to work with, that reducing Cold War tensions required engaging with the American president despite ideological differences, and that Reagan's anti-communism might actually provide political advantages because Reagan could sell arms control to conservative American constituencies in ways that more liberal American leaders might not achieve. The Geneva summit was designed to allow the two leaders to meet personally, to assess each other's intentions, and to explore whether possibilities existed for reducing tensions. What happened at Geneva surprised both leaders and their advisors. The formal meetings were predictably difficult, with each side presenting positions the other found unacceptable and with little progress on substantive issues. But the personal interactions during breaks from formal sessions revealed unexpected compatibility, with both leaders discovering they could talk to each other directly, that they shared recognition that nuclear war was unacceptable, and that they possessed similar abilities to focus on essential issues while setting aside ideological rhetoric. The moment Gorbachev would later describe as transformative occurred during a walk the two leaders took to a boathouse on Lake Geneva, away from advisors and interpreters, where Reagan surprised Gorbachev by proposing that they address each other as Ron and Mikhail, and by suggesting that if Earth faced invasion from alien beings, the United States and Soviet Union would surely cooperate to defend humanity. So why couldn't they cooperate to address actual threats both nations faced, including nuclear weapons? The statement was vintage Reagan, mixing homespun philosophy with science fiction references in ways that sophisticated diplomats found unsophisticated, but that often cut through diplomatic cant to essential truths. And Gorbachev's response was to laugh and to agree that cooperation made more sense than confrontation. The Geneva summit produced no major agreements, but established personal relationship and created framework for subsequent meetings. Gorbachev returned to Moscow, convinced that Reagan could be negotiated with despite his conservative rhetoric, that the American president genuinely wanted to reduce nuclear dangers, and that reducing Cold War tensions might be possible if both leaders could manage their respective bureaucracies and domestic political constituencies. The subsequent summits, Reykjavik in October 1986, Washington in December 1987, and Moscow in May 1988, demonstrated both the possibilities and the limits of Reagan-Gorbachev cooperation. At Reykjavik, the two leaders came astonishingly close to agreeing to eliminate all nuclear weapons within 10 years, a proposal that would have transformed international relations, but that founded on Reagan's refusal to abandon SDI research. The disagreement was bitter, and both leaders left feeling that a historic opportunity had been lost, but the discussions also demonstrated how far both were willing to go in pursuing arms reductions and created momentum that eventually produced the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty signed in Washington in December 1987. Eliminating an entire category of nuclear weapons for the first time in history. The Washington summit represented the high point of Reagan-Gorbachev cooperation in the moment when both leaders recognized that the Cold War was ending not through military victory, but through negotiated transformation. Reagan hosted Gorbachev at the White House with ceremonies that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. Gorbachev's visit included not just official meetings but public appearances, where American crowds greeted him with enthusiasm that reflected changing perceptions of the Soviet Union. But Gorbachev also faced increasing difficulties at home as his reform programs produced economic dislocation without the prosperity he had promised, as glasnost unleashed nationalist movements and political opposition that threatened Soviet unity, and as conservative Communist Party members grew alarmed at reforms that seemed to undermine the system. The military spending reductions Gorbachev needed required arms control agreements with the United States, but achieving such agreements meant making concessions that Soviet military leaders opposed and that conservative critics characterized as weakness. Reagan's Moscow summit visit in May 1988 occurred as Gorbachev's domestic position was weakening. Reagan walked through Red Square with Gorbachev discussing religious freedom and human rights, issues that Soviet leaders had traditionally insisted were internal Soviet affairs. Reagan met with Soviet dissidents and human rights activists, sending messages about American values that previous Soviet leaders would have protested, but that Gorbachev accepted as part of improved relations. Reagan left office in January 1989 with the Cold War clearly ending, but with Soviet Union still existing. Gorbachev continued implementing reforms he hoped would save Soviet socialism through transforming it, but events escaped his control as Eastern European nations broke free from Soviet domination in 1989, as the Berlin Wall fell in November 1989, and as Soviet republics declared independence throughout 1990 and 1991. The Soviet Union's formal dissolution in December 1991 represented Gorbachev's political defeat. He resigned as president of a country that no longer existed, but also represented the peaceful end of the Cold War that both Reagan and Gorbachev had worked to achieve. The years after both leaders left power saw continuing debate about who deserved credit for ending the Cold War. Reagan's supporters argued that his military buildup and confrontational rhetoric had forced the Soviet Union into competitions it could not sustain, that his pressure had exposed Soviet economic weakness and had convinced Soviet leaders, including Gorbachev, that reforms were necessary. Gorbachev and his supporters argued that Soviet reforms were driven by internal Soviet recognition that changes were necessary, that Reagan's military buildup had actually delayed reforms by strengthening Soviet conservatives, and that the Cold War ended because Gorbachev made conscious choices to transform Soviet policies despite enormous domestic political risks. Reagan's diagnosis with Alzheimer's disease, announced publicly in November 1994, removed him from public life, transformed him into increasingly distant memory. Gorbachev watched Reagan's decline from Moscow, where Gorbachev struggled to remain politically relevant in a Russia that had moved beyond the ideological conflicts that had defined Gorbachev's career. The two former leaders did not maintain close personal contact after leaving office, but Gorbachev followed news of Reagan's condition and reflected on their shared experiences. The tribute Gorbachev composed on the evening of Reagan's death represented the most honest assessment Gorbachev had provided of Reagan's role in ending the Cold War. The statement began with conventional expressions of sympathy, but then moved to more personal reflections that revealed Gorbachev's complex feelings about the man who had been simultaneously his partner and his rival. Ronald Reagan was a man of instinct rather than ideology, Gorbachev wrote, choosing words carefully. He believed deeply in his country and in his country's values, but he was not imprisoned by dogma in ways that prevented him from recognizing opportunities for reducing tensions and achieving agreements that served both nations' interests. His rhetoric was often confrontational and sometimes offensive to Soviet witches, particularly his characterization of the Soviet Union as an evil empire. But when we met personally, when we talked directly about issues, I discovered that his commitment to reducing nuclear dangers and to improving Soviet-American relations was genuine, and that he was willing to take political risks to achieve these goals. The statement continued with specific acknowledgments of Reagan's contributions that Gorbachev had been reluctant to make during the 1990s. President Reagan's military buildup in the 1980s created pressures on the Soviet economy that contributed to our recognition that reforms were necessary, Gorbachev wrote, making an admission that validated Reagan's supporters' interpretation. His Strategic Defense Initiative, which I opposed vigorously and which I still believe was technically unrealistic and strategically destabilizing, nonetheless demonstrated that the United States was prepared to invest enormous resources in military competition, and that the Soviet Union could not match American technological capabilities without destroying our economy. But the most revealing passage addressed Reagan's personal qualities. Ronald Reagan possessed optimism that was sometimes frustrating to someone like myself, who had been trained to analyze problems through examining contradictions and through understanding historical forces. Gorbachev wrote, he believed that problems could be solved through determination and through faith in human goodness, beliefs that seemed naive from perspective of someone who had experienced the brutalities of Stalinist repression and the complexities of Soviet politics. But this optimism was also Reagan's great strength, because it allowed him to imagine possibilities that more conventional leaders dismissed as unrealistic, and because it enabled him to communicate hope to ordinary people in ways that inspired them to believe that better futures were possible. The statement concluded with reflections on how Reagan would be remembered. History will debate endlessly who deserved credit for ending the Cold War, Gorbachev wrote. I believe that both President Reagan and I contributed to the Cold War's peaceful conclusion, that neither of us alone could have achieved what our cooperation produced, and that the true victors were the peoples of both our nations who were freed from nuclear dangers and from ideological conflicts that had dominated their lives for 2 generations. President Reagan and I did not agree on many issues, and we each represented different visions of how societies should be organized. But we shared recognition that war was unacceptable, that our responsibilities as leaders required us to seek peaceful resolution of conflicts, and that future generations would judge us not by our ideological commitments, but by whether we used our power wisely. The statement was released to international media on June 6, 2004, and generated significant attention, both for what it said and for what its timing revealed about Gorbachev's evolution in understanding Reagan. The admission that Reagan's military pressure had contributed to Soviet recognition that reforms were necessary represented significant concession from Gorbachev, who had spent the 1990s arguing that Soviet reforms were independent Soviet choices. The acknowledgement of Reagan's personal qualities represented recognition of attributes that Gorbachev's Marxist training had taught him to dismiss, but that he now understood had been sources of Reagan's strength. In interviews during subsequent years, Gorbachev's assessments of Reagan became more generous. Reagan understood that the Cold War could not continue indefinitely, that at some point either the superpowers would go to war or they would find ways to end their confrontation peacefully, Gorbachev said in a 2009 interview. His combination of military strength and willingness to negotiate created conditions where peaceful ending was possible. I did not appreciate fully at the time how carefully Reagan balanced these elements, but looking back, I recognize that his approach was strategically sound, even though his rhetoric was often excessive. What Gorbachev finally admitted about Reagan after Reagan died was that the American president had been right about fundamental issues, even when his rhetoric was excessive. Reagan had been right that Soviet economic system was failing and that attempting to sustain military competition with the United States was bankrupting the Soviet economy. Reagan had been right that peoples living under communist rule wanted freedom and that Soviet external empire could not be maintained indefinitely through force. Reagan had been right that nuclear weapons were immoral and that leaders had responsibility to reduce nuclear dangers. And Reagan had been right that optimism and faith in human goodness were more powerful forces for change than sophisticated analysis that accepted existing conditions as permanent constraints. These admissions were painful for someone who had devoted his life to building Soviet socialism and who still believed that socialist values were superior to capitalist values. But Gorbachev's honesty about Reagan also reflected wisdom that comes with age and historical perspective, recognition that ideological certainties that had seemed unquestionable during years of political struggle appeared more ambiguous from distance of decades, and acknowledgement that Reagan had possessed qualities of leadership that Gorbachev respected even when Reagan's policies conflicted with Soviet interests. Gorbachev lived until August 2022. Surviving Reagan by nearly 2 decades and witnessing developments in post-Soviet Russia that often dismayed him. His final years were marked by marginalization in Putin's Russia and by sadness that the optimism of the late 1980s had given way to new confrontations between Russia and the West. But Gorbachev never retreated from his conviction that ending the Cold War peacefully had been the right choice, that cooperation with Reagan had served Soviet interests despite criticisms, and that both leaders deserved recognition for preventing the nuclear catastrophe that would have destroyed civilization if the Cold War had ended differently. What Gorbachev admitted about Reagan after Reagan's death was that his former adversary had been a great leader whose vision and courage had contributed essentially to the 20th century's most important peaceful transformation, and that their partnership, however limited by ideological differences and however uncomfortable for both men politically, had demonstrated that even the deepest conflicts can be resolved peacefully when leaders possess wisdom to recognize shared humanity and determination to choose cooperation over confrontation.